Welcome to episode 92, Europe's Indo-Pacific Ambition, Strategic Goals and Realities, the part 2. So we are continuing from the episode 91 where we left. So, taking a deep dive into this topic, we have discussed in the previous episode about the Indo-Pacific strategy from the Europe's perspective, as well as from the individual some of the European countries like France, Germany, and UK. So now we'll be taking a much more deep dive into the last part of the topic. So I would like to come to this part, Jason, where we also look at some of the aspects of China as well as the impact assessment from side. So, what impact does Europe's approach in the Indo-Pacific have on its relation with ASEAN countries?
I think first of all, it's important to see or to look a bit at the differences between Europe and the ASEAN countries. When we look at ASEAN from a European perspective, some people basically expect that it's going to work the same because, I mean, it's a grouping of countries. But this is not the case because the institutional links on the European side and in general, the level of institutionalization of the European Union cannot at all be compared to ASEAN, where the existing multilateral structures are just much weaker. Like, for example, the EU has much more competence in. We have EU law, and we have so many directives, and basically, the EU as an institution has exclusive competences and can act on behalf of the member states. This is something that we do not see in ASEAN. So although there are two multilateral formats, so EU to ASEAN, a lot of that still happens in, let's say, a bilateral framework. So EU plus one country from ASEAN. In general, I think that the trend is that the relationships have been getting much closer, and also that there is across the board much more interest now in the ASEAN countries, whether you're looking at the individual level of European states that regularly and increasingly travel to be it Jakarta or other like Ho Chi Minh City, anything like the pure contacts and to travel have significantly increased, I would say, in the last 5 years, which already shows that there is a willingness to really increase
Yes.
the relationships. And then you also see that things are moving ahead on the EU level, especially in the field of trade with, for example, the free trade agreement with the Philippines or with India being negotiated. So there is certainly a willingness to work there.
Interesting. And coming to the part of China, which is, I think, I would say the hot plate for countries like US, India, and Japan and Australia as well. But of course, we won't be touching that part of the Quad, I would say. But from the perspective of China in general, how does Europe balance its Indo-Pacific ambition with its ties to China, especially considering the economic dependencies?
So, a line that has been given by EU Commission President von der Leyen last year in early 2023 was the approach of de risking, which basically means that Europeans maintain economic links with China. This means that they are not what the US is often calling for decoupling and totally cutting off all ties, but it means to reduce strategic dependencies that can potentially be weaponized and therefore constitute vulnerabilities. Meaning that, for example, supply chains for critical goods need to be diversified. And that, for example, is something that directly plays out
Yeah.
in the EU's relations with the Indo-Pacific countries, because there is a clear reason why the EU, for example, is very engaged in seeking negotiations with countries in the Indo-Pacific on free trade agreements. It's that is one of the elements, for example. But of course, for Europeans, it's certainly a balancing act, particularly when they are, let's say, sending statements on rules-based international order, condemning or basically criticizing China's action in the South China Sea, or also,
Yeah.
for example, as or as governments do it, kind of send warships as freedom of navigation missions, or just because it's considered open ways for like maritime navigation through the Taiwan Strait. There is, of
Yes.
course, always a risk that Beijing might retaliate that with economic measures. So
Yes.
Europeans are very, very cautious in their approaches also in the Indo-Pacific because their economic ties with China are just extremely close. So it is to some extent a balancing act, but it's also important that much of that is not necessarily mutually exclusive. So for many
Yes.
Europeans, there is no problem at all to have very close trade relationships with China and at the same time enhance other relations. Let's say, for
Mm.
example, on skills partnerships also
Okay.
with other partners in the Indo-Pacific. The more delicate balancing act for them is really the security side. So the question, do we participate in a joint exercise like the Pacific Skies or Pitch Black? Because all that is going to send a signal to China, and Beijing will also react to that. But on the other hand, Europeans also think, often see it as important to underline that there is certain action that they do not want to tolerate. And this signaling is therefore part of the broader strategy to the region.
Interesting. And coming to more of the broader perspective, I would say taking a zoom out from China. So, how do considerations regarding the transatlantic relationship influence European approaches to the Indo-Pacific?
That is, in my opinion, maybe the most interesting part of the entire European Indo-Pacific conundrum, simply because I like to say that Europe's China challenge, to take a term that the US is often used, they often refer to China as a China challenge. And I think Europe's China challenge is not necessarily in Beijing. So, of course, Europeans have to make up their mind about how they are going to deal with China. But for them, the big question mark on China is basically the United States. Because Europeans are economically immensely dependent on China, but they are, in terms of their security, immensely dependent on the United States through NATO, through nuclear sharing, through the security guarantees that the United States give to Europe. And at the same time, the United States are pressuring Europeans to align with their approach and to basically harden their stance towards China, which is something that Europeans are often a bit, or have been a bit skeptical about. They have been trying to, I would say, do some hedging. On the one hand, having relationships with China through the trade angle, having other relations, and of course, historically also very strong relations with the United States, and then
Yes.
muddle through. And that has, I would say, worked relatively well until now. But when, like particularly with the United States, that are very much concerned, one could also say almost obsessed with the idea of competition with China, that makes life for Europeans not necessarily easier because it constitutes two dilemmas. One, of course, is what in political science we call an entrapment dilemma. So that at one point, the United States is just the strongest ally in NATO and, yeah, key ally in security for many Europeans, will ask
Yes.
Europeans to follow their approach in return for security guarantees, or might say to Europeans, we helped you in Ukraine, now it's payback time. You side with us on China, and you make sure that you decouple and take all the measures we want you to take. That is one point. Then there is, of course, a fear of abandonment as well on the European side, meaning that Europeans are very, very concerned that when they are not really following the US, the United States might decide to basically let European security totally to Europeans, especially if there was, for example, a Trump administration, and then focus exclusively on the Indo-Pacific, which would be extremely problematic because a lot of European deterrence de facto depends on the United States.
Yes.
So there's this element, and another element that I think is also absolutely not to be underestimated is the risk of extraterritorial sanctions, because even if, let's say, the United States do not coerce or force Europeans to follow them on all elements, there is still a risk that there might be extraterritorial sanctions hitting European companies that are still dealing with China. So
Yes.
beyond this, I would say, big strategic question that governments have to face, companies are also really facing challenges with regard to the United States.
Interesting. And I would say a little bit going ahead into the technological side, not on the deep tech side, but in general, just touching up the technological advancements. So, what role does digital and technological cooperation play in Europe's Indo-Pacific engagement?
So that is certainly an aspect that is becoming increasingly important. We also see it, for example, in the Global Gateway to some extent, like this
Yes.
initiative from the European Union. But I think what is interesting is to see that the EU now is having or is negotiating digital trade agreements. We have one with Singapore, and Korea is also on the way. So there is more and more willingness to also reflect not only on trade in goods, but also, for example, in services. And in general, one of the major challenges when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategy is, of course, also, for example, the entire question of semiconductors and
Yes.
critical materials, critical components, and so on. And establishing supply chains with countries where these are produced is one of the key European interests. So I would say digital and technological cooperation certainly play a role in the engagement, but Europeans also are aware that it sometimes off the coast comes at the coast, that there is an interest in technology transfer, and that there is really a willingness also on both sides to co-build or to co-develop
Yes.
industries, and that's also why we see increasing joint R&D, so research and development initiatives. You see a lot of, for example, also joint research projects between labs, between companies, between universities. So this has been significantly enhanced over the last years.
Interesting. And, I would say this is the final part of the topic, I would say. So, what are the long term prospects of Europe's strategic presence in the Indo Pacific, and how might they evolve with respect to the kind of dynamics that you have just mentioned? Or do you see any other pathway from your own research about the evolvement of this situation?
So I would expect Europeans to not significantly step up their security and defense engagement in the region, simply because, from a capability perspective, Europeans will be extremely busy managing European security. So we might
Yes.
see joint exercises to reassure partners. We might see freedom of navigation exercises. But this idea that Europeans might send a lot of European assets to the Indo-Pacific, for example, also in case of a Taiwan scenario, I do really not see that because that is not what European militaries are basically trained for and equipped for. So I think there might be this angle of reassurance, of strategic presence, but I don't see Europeans become major military actors in the Indo-Pacific. And I also think that Europeans are very well aware of their limits there. Although, for example, as I said, the joint exercises and so on to reassure partners, that is certainly something that will continue, I think. Overall, in terms of long-term prospects, I think that we can continue to expect a certain division of labor between the European Union and the individual member states, with the EU, of course, continuing to play the major role when it comes to things like trade, connectivity, climate, joint
Yes.
initiatives, potentially also on tech, whereas the member states might play the key role on security. One thing that I think is absolutely worth watching is the potential of the launch of so-called coordinated maritime presences of the European Union. That is an EU instrument where EU member states jointly deploy naval assets, so basically ships, to areas that are designated as areas of maritime interest. That is a decision that is taken
Interesting.
normally by the council, and then it is much easier for Europeans to jointly deploy because they can better draw on the coordination structures that also exist in the European Union. And for the moment, the northwestern Indian Ocean is one of these areas. But if the council decided that this also applies to other areas, one might also
Yes.
expect that in the future.
That's an interesting take. So I believe there have been several questions which have popped up during the conversation, and I hope in the future we will record few more episodes to cover that with Jazin. And that's, I would say, the end of the topic, but we still are not done with this episode, because there is one last question that I would like to ask, because I believe every expert who comes on this podcast has something or the other in terms of anecdotes or maybe key takeaways to offer to the future leaders who are taking participation or trying to take an engagement assignments into this domain. Maybe it's space, defense, security, international relations, or geopolitics. So, Jason, this question is from that perspective, as we have covered this topic in depth, and let's turn to the topic of the work in the international relations domain, because I believe there are several students and researchers, and as well as the scholars who are trying to basically shift their gears into the international relations, who listen to this podcast. So, and experts like you having your suggestions will always be definitely on a positive side, helping them in one or the other way. So, what message or advice would you like to give to the researcher students and experts who are trying to make their way into the international relations domain, or who are already present in this domain, who are trying to scale the kind of niche expertise they're trying to find, the way you have niche expertise into, kind of Indo-Pacific or maritime domain? So, yeah, please let us, thoughts know about this. Yeah.
Yeah, you already mentioned one word that I noted here when I was doing my preparation, and that is the niche. And I think that
Yes.
is extremely important. So
Yes.
I would say if I have to give one advice, that would be you're good at what you like and what you're interested in. And that
Yes.
is, I think, why it's really important to find your niche of interest, to find the topic that you can't stop thinking about, and then yeah, really work on that topic, read everything you can, and excel, because you're going to be good in what you like. Or
Yes.
let's say you can be good in things that where you, yeah, that basically you have to do, but you will be excellent in the things that you like.
Yes.
And I think that is a really important point of departure. And for that, I would also say there's nothing wrong with being a nerd and being a bit nerdy about a topic. So even if your topic looks like a total niche topic
Yes.
at the moment, I think there is, of course, it might be challenging sometimes to kind of find a job because let's say when you, for example, studied Chinese in the 90s
Yeah.
or so, there was not an abundance of jobs for people. But today that looks
Yes.
quite different, I would say. And maybe to end that with an anecdote from my personal side, when I started my PhD in 2020 and drafted the research proposal, which I still did in 2019 back in Beijing, I, however, decided to do it on European defense. And I always thought I want to do European defense first, really want to understand the underlying mechanisms of European
Yes.
security and defense cooperation, because I'm just deeply fascinated by that. And then I can bring my China expertise. And many people were like, honestly, why are you doing Europe? China is the next big thing. You don't even
Yeah.
have wars in Europe. It is such a niche topic. And here we are 4 years later.
Absolutely.
5 years ago, people were asking me why I went to China and where I learned Chinese and how I want to link that to Europe.
Yeah.
And here we are, 5 years later. We talk more about European security and defense in a week than we did
Yeah.
10 years ago, maybe in a full year.
Yes.
And the relations between Europe and China are just a critical part of that.
Absolutely.
So even if people tell you your topic might maybe not as relevant as you think, if it's really what you're passionate about, you find a way to basically create your professional path around that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on this part that, you should always go with what you love, because you'll be definitely good at it. Something or the other comes around, as you mentioned. 5 years ago, people were talking to you like, why are you doing this? And now the things are completely different, since especially the Russia-Ukraine war, things have shifted. The power shift is happening. Europe is in the focus at the moment, in a lot of ways. So yeah, thank you very much again, Jason, for insightful conversation. And I really hope to record few more episodes with you in the future as we proceed ahead and as you progress with your research as well in your career. I really hope to do a one-on-one conversation again. Maybe not specifically on Indo-Pacific, but maybe on the European defense and security in the future.
I'm
Yeah.
really much looking forward to that. Thank you again for
Yes.
having me. That was a great
Absolutely. Yeah.
conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.